So, let me set the stage for you. A 29-year-old woman named Sarah, married to her 30-year-old husband, Alex, both of whom have just found themselves standing at the crossroads of family, faith, and freedom. Now, Sarah was always a quiet, easygoing person, never one to rock the boat. But then, one fateful day, everything changed. The moment Sarah found herself sitting across from her in-laws, who were about to throw a bombshell at her, one that would shake her entire world. The conversation started out innocently enough. Small talk, a bit of the usual chit-chat about the weather, the kids, and family gossip. But Sarah could feel it, the tension hanging thick in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. She just couldn't quite put her finger on what was coming, but she knew something was off. Alex seemed a little quieter than usual, his eyes darting between Sarah and his parents. He knew this conversation was inevitable. It was always hanging over them, like an elephant in the room no one dared to acknowledge. The moment her mother-in-law, Brenda, leaned forward and looked Sarah dead in the eye, the air in the room shifted. You know that feeling when you sense something bad's about to happen but you're too stunned to react in time? That's exactly how Sarah felt. Sarah, Brenda began, her voice unnervingly calm, we've been meaning to talk to you about something important. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. What was it? She wasn't prepared for what came next. We love you, honey, we really do. But we can't support you if you don't convert. Her words hung in the air like a sudden slap. Convert? What was she talking about? Sarah's mind raced. Alex had grown up in a deeply religious family. His parents were devout, their faith everything to them. But Sarah? She didn't share that same belief. She'd always been open-minded and respectful of their faith, but she wasn't about to change everything about herself just to please them. She was raised with a different set of values, and though she loved Alex with all her heart, she never intended to be forced into something she didn't believe in. Brenda wasn't done. Her voice, though soft, carried an undercurrent of something chilling. If you want to stay in this family, dear, you'll need to embrace our ways. That's just how it works here. Sarah's pulse quickened. She glanced at Alex, hoping he would say something, hoping he would step in, but he was silent. His face was unreadable, his lips pressed tight. It was as if he was bracing for impact, but Sarah, she had no idea how deep this was about to go. I don't think you understand, Brenda continued. If you don't convert, we'll have no choice but to cut you off. Completely. Your place in this family will be gone. You'll never see us again. It's that simple. There it was. The ultimatum. In an instant, Sarah felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. This wasn't just a difference of opinions. This was a demand, a condition that could destroy everything she had built with Alex, her home, her life, her future. For a second, her mind went completely blank, unable to comprehend how something so ridiculous, so manipulative, could come from people she thought she knew. It felt like she was suffocating in the silence of the room. But then, something snapped inside her. She didn't know whether it was the exhaustion of constantly walking on eggshells around her in-laws, or the deep-rooted resentment that had been quietly festering for years. She had always been the one to compromise, always the one to give in for the sake of peace, for the sake of Alex's family, but now, this was too much. Brenda's words hit like a punch to the gut, but Sarah wasn't going to break. She wasn't going to let them win. Not this time. Her eyes met Alex's, and the look they shared spoke volumes. This was it. No more pretending, no more pleasing people who didn't care about her or her beliefs. They were her family, too, and she wasn't about to let anyone dictate her life. So Sarah stood up, her legs shaking but her resolve growing stronger with each passing second. She looked at Alex one last time, and in that moment, something shifted between them. They were a team. Always had been, and always would be. "I can't do that," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I'm not going to change for anyone. Not even for you." The silence in the room was deafening. Brenda's face twisted, her eyes narrowing. But Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't back down. In the next instant, Alex stood up beside her, his face hard as stone, and together, they walked out of the house, leaving everything behind. It was the beginning of something Sarah had never expected, but deep down, she knew it was the right thing. But was it enough? Would they ever be able to fully escape the weight of the decision they had just made? This was only the start. And things were about to get a lot more complicated. So there they were, Sarah and Alex, standing on the precipice of a decision that would change everything. They had left the house, walked out of Brenda and Stan's, Alex's parents, without a second thought. The air was thick with tension, and neither of them knew exactly what to do next. All Sarah could hear was the deafening echo of her heart racing. It felt freeing, sure, but also terrifying. As they drove back to their apartment in silence, Sarah's mind spun. They'd just made the most monumental decision of their lives, and they didn't even have a plan. "I can't believe this is happening," Alex finally broke the silence. His voice was shaky, as if he was still processing everything. "I mean, they really threatened to cut us out. Just like that." His hand gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles turning white. Sarah didn't respond immediately. What was there to say? She'd been so sure of what she wanted, so confident in her decision. But now, as they drove away from the family that had been a huge part of Alex's life, she felt the weight of the consequences start to sink in. Would this really be the end of their relationship with his family? Would they actually sever ties like that? She glanced at him, her heart aching for the man beside her. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about Alex, too. His entire life had been tied up in this family, his values, his upbringing, everything. And now he was being asked to choose between them and her. Between everything he'd been taught to believe and the life they were trying to build together. "I didn't think they'd go that far," Sarah said quietly. Her voice wavered, even though she didn't want it to. "I knew they were religious, but this... I didn't think they'd give us an ultimatum." Alex's jaw clenched, and he glanced at her for a moment before returning his eyes to the road. "Neither did I. But they were always pushing it, Sarah. You knew that. The pressure. The constant, little comments. This was coming. I just didn't expect it to be like this." As they pulled into their apartment parking lot, the reality of what they'd done began to settle in. The once comfortable space they'd shared with his family dinners, holidays, even the occasional weekend visit, felt distant now. What would they do without that? How would they survive on their own, without the safety net they'd once taken for granted? Maybe we can work things out," Alex said, sounding uncertain now, his earlier confidence faltering. "I can talk to them. I can explain. I didn't want it to come to this. They'll come around, right?" But Sarah wasn't sure. She wasn't sure if talking it out was even an option anymore. The ultimatum was clear, and they had both made their choices. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized just how much they were risking by standing their ground. It wasn't just about the family connection, or the holidays, or the support they might lose. It was everything. What if they were isolated? What if Alex's family turned their backs on them completely? As she looked at her husband, she could see the turmoil written all over his face. The conflict in his eyes. She knew how much he loved his parents, how hard this decision had been for him. It wasn't just about his upbringing. It was about losing everything he knew. The religious connection. The sense of belonging. But what about Sarah? What was she supposed to do? She couldn't pretend anymore. She couldn't hide behind pleasantries or fake her way through family dinners where everyone would stare at her, judging her for the choices she'd made. They sat there, in the car, for what felt like an eternity, neither of them saying anything more. The silence between them wasn't comfortable. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like the air before a storm. Finally, Alex spoke again. What if they never accept us again? What if we lose them for good? His voice broke slightly. I can't do this alone, Sarah. Her heart cracked a little as she reached over, her hand resting on his arm. She knew how hard this was for him. They both knew that walking away from his family was a huge risk, and there was no going back. But what were they supposed to do? He was asking for her to fix something that neither of them could control. Alex, we're not alone. We have each other. And we'll figure this out. But we can't let them dictate our lives. Not like this. But as the words left her mouth, Sarah felt the doubt creeping in. She couldn't ignore it anymore. What would they do without the safety of family? Without the network of support that had always been there, however flawed it was? Was their love for each other really enough to withstand the storm that was about to hit? That night, they lay in bed, staring at the ceiling in the dark. Neither of them slept much. The weight of their decision was too heavy, pressing down on them like 1,000 pounds of pressure. They had made a stand. But at what cost? And then, the first text came. It was from Alex's sister. The message was short, but the tone was unmistakable. Mom and Dad are furious. They say you've turned your back on everything. Don't expect to hear from us again. Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat. There it was, the confirmation of what they'd feared. They were being cut out. Just like that. The message buzzed again, this time from Alex's father. You'll regret this. You've broken your family apart. Sarah's chest tightened as Alex read the messages. His eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and rage. But Sarah, though shaken, knew one thing for sure: they had made their choice. And they would have to live with it. But what came next? Would they be able to rebuild their lives without the very people they thought they could count on? Or would this be the beginning of the end? The next few days after leaving Alex's parents' house felt like an endless cycle of waking up to anxiety, processing emotions, and trying to figure out where the hell they were supposed to go from here. They had no clear plan. No backup. No idea how to navigate the fallout of cutting ties with his family over something as huge as religion. Everything that had felt solid was now shaky, like a fragile house of cards that could collapse at any moment. Sarah tried to keep her focus on the here and now. She threw herself into work, diving headfirst into her freelance projects just to keep her mind busy. But no matter how much she worked, that gnawing feeling in her stomach never went away. Alex did the same, but he was much quieter. It was clear he was struggling with this whole thing, even if he was trying his best to act like it was all going to work out. Sarah could see the cracks in his facade, when he stared off into space, when he paused mid-sentence, the weight of it all pressing on him. They didn't speak much about his family. Not at first. It was too raw. Too fresh. But Sarah knew that avoiding the elephant in the room wasn't going to make it go away. So, one night, after dinner, as they sat on the couch, silence hanging between them like an old, uncomfortable friend, she decided it was time. She had to bring it up. Alex, you can't keep pretending this isn't eating at you. Her voice was soft, but it had a firmness to it that made him pause. He looked over at her, and for a second, she saw the vulnerability in his eyes that he always tried to hide. He didn't want to talk about it, but she knew he needed to. They both needed to. I'm fine, he said, but it wasn't convincing. He shifted uncomfortably, running a hand through his hair. Are you? Sarah pressed, her gaze steady. Because we're in this together. and I'm not about to watch you fall apart without us addressing it. You don't have to go through this alone." He let out a long sigh, exhaling like he'd been holding his breath for days. "I don't know how to fix it, Sarah. I don't know if I even want to fix it. I mean, what if I'm never going to see them again? What if they really meant it when they said they'd cut us out? What if we ruined everything for nothing?" The desperation in his voice hit Sarah harder than she expected. She reached out, placing a hand over his, trying to ground him, trying to offer some form of comfort. "We didn't ruin anything, Alex. You didn't choose this. We didn't choose this. They gave us an impossible choice, and we just chose to keep our integrity." His eyes met hers, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something, relief? Hope? He wasn't sure either. He still had doubts, still wasn't fully convinced they'd done the right thing, but there was something about the way Sarah spoke that made him feel like they might actually be able to handle this. But the doubt kept creeping in. That night, after Sarah went to bed, Alex stayed up. He stared at the ceiling for hours, thinking about his parents, about everything he'd left behind. He couldn't shake the guilt. How could he? They'd been the ones who'd raised him, shaped him into the person he was. And now, it felt like he was losing them forever. The next morning, just when Sarah thought maybe they could start to move forward, the text messages came flooding in. It was like a tidal wave of anger and disappointment crashing into their lives all over again. From his dad, "I can't believe you let her take you down this path. You've turned your back on everything we taught you." From his mom, "You're dead to us. Don't bother coming to family events. We won't be supporting you anymore." And then, from his sister, "Why are you doing this? They're heartbroken. Don't you care about your family at all?" The texts burned like acid. Sarah watched as Alex's face crumpled, the weight of his family's words hitting him harder than he let on. "I don't know if I can handle this," he whispered, his voice breaking. Her heart ached for him. She wished she could take away the pain. But she also knew that this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about them. About their future together. "I know, baby," she said softly, squeezing his hand. "But we'll get through this. Together. You're not alone in this. We've got each other." But even as the words left her lips, she felt a nagging fear gnawing at the back of her mind. They hadn't heard the last of his family. And things were about to get even harder. The next day, Alex's mother called. He hesitated for a long time before answering. Sarah could feel the tension in his posture as he picked up the phone. "Mom," he said, his voice tense. It was his mother's voice on the other end, harsh, cold, and unyielding. "You've made your choice, Alex. I hope you know that this is permanent. We won't be accepting you back into the family. Ever." And that was it. The final nail in the coffin. The words rang in Alex's ears, and Sarah watched his face as the life drained out of him. His worst fear had come true. The person he thought would always love him unconditionally, the woman who had always told him she would support him no matter what, had just told him that he was no longer a part of her world. For a moment, Sarah wondered if they had made a mistake. But then she looked at Alex, his face pale and broken, and she knew. This was it. They were on their own now. And whether they liked it or not, they had to fight for what they had, or risk losing it all. The question was, how far would they have to go to prove they were willing to lose everything? Things had escalated quickly. What started as an emotional whirlwind, one text at a time, turned into something far more intense. It was like a bomb had gone off in their lives, and now, there was no escaping the fallout. The worst part? They had no idea how deep this rabbit hole would go, but they had a feeling they were only just scratching the surface. Alex had barely been able to get through a single day without a message or a call from one of his family members, each one somehow more cutting than the last. They weren't just hurt anymore, they were angry, bitter. His mom, especially, had been relentless. Every conversation, every message felt like a slap in the face, each word more venomous than the last. One night, after Sarah had finished another late-night project and Alex was still scrolling through his phone, she saw him tense up. His entire posture shifted, and Sarah could feel the heat radiating off him from across the room. She already knew. She didn't need to see the screen to know who it was. "It's them again, isn't it?" she asked quietly, her voice careful. Alex didn't respond at first. He just sat there, his jaw clenched so tight she thought it might snap. After a long, agonizing silence, he finally said, "Yeah. They keep calling. My mom, Dad, even Rachel. They're not letting it go, Sarah." He had been avoiding talking about his family, but now it was different. The anger was raw, spilling out with every word. "They keep telling me how I'm destroying everything, how I'm turning my back on them." His voice cracked, but there was something else in it, too. Something deeper than just pain. "I'm not sure I can do this anymore. It's like they're pushing me away on purpose." Sarah's heart broke at that. She knew this wasn't just about religion anymore. It wasn't even about her. This was about family, love, guilt, and the life Alex had always known crashing down around him. She got up and walked over, sitting beside him. No more pretending. She wasn't going to lie to him. She knew this would tear him apart, but the truth needed to come out. "They're not going to stop, Alex," she said gently. "You've seen it, right? They're not going to listen to reason. They've made their choice. They're pushing you away, pushing us away." His hand tightened into a fist as he stared at the floor. "I don't know if I can just let it go. This is my family, Sarah. The only family I've ever known." She understood. God, did she understand? But this wasn't just about him. It was about both of them, their future, their freedom. "I know you're torn, baby," she said softly. "But we've got each other. And sometimes that's all we need. If they won't accept us for who we are, for what we believe, then maybe it's time we stop trying to fit into a mold that doesn't work for us." Alex's face twisted, a mixture of frustration and fear etched across his features. She could see it, the doubt gnawing at him. "But what if we can't fix this? What if we're making a huge mistake?" The question lingered, heavy, as Sarah took a breath. "If we don't fight for what we believe in, for our own happiness, then what's the point? I don't want to spend the rest of my life pretending, Alex. You don't either. We deserve more than that." His eyes softened, but the confusion and fear didn't leave. He wasn't ready to let go. He couldn't, he didn't know how. "I don't know what to do with all this, Sarah. I love them. I don't know if I can live with losing them." She reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. "I don't want you to lose them either. But we've got to choose each other, Alex. We've got to choose us." It was in that moment, the silence that followed, that something inside him seemed to shift. His shoulders slumped, as if a huge weight had just settled into his chest. Maybe he was starting to understand. Maybe he was finally beginning to accept that their life together, their future, meant more than any old tradition or family expectation. But then came the phone call. The one they knew was coming, but still weren't prepared for. It was his father this time. His voice was sharp, unrelenting. "You've made your bed, Alex. You've chosen her over us. Over everything we've done for you. And you'll regret it." The words, like daggers, tore through the air, and Sarah saw Alex flinch. He looked shattered. "I've never been more disappointed in you," his father's voice continued. "You've failed us. You'll see. You'll see just how wrong you are. You're throwing your life away." Alex's face drained of color as he listened. He didn't speak for a long moment, his grip tightening around the phone. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, more composed than before. "Maybe I will," he said softly, barely above a whisper. "Maybe I will regret it. But I'm not turning back now. I can't." He hung up the phone, and for a moment, they both sat there in a heavy silence. Sarah reached over, her fingers gently brushing his hand. She didn't know what he was feeling in that moment, but she knew it was a crossroads. It was a turning point. And no matter how much it hurt, no matter how much it felt like they were losing everything, Sarah knew something had changed inside Alex. Maybe they weren't going to get everything they wanted. Maybe the family wasn't going to welcome them back with open arms. But in that moment, Alex had made a choice. He was no longer bound by their expectations. They had their own path now, and they would walk it together, no matter how difficult it might be. "I'm proud of you," Sarah whispered, her voice steady and warm. "No matter what happens, I'm proud of you." For the first time in days, Alex smiled, a real smile, one that lit up his entire face. And in that moment, Sarah realized something. They had each other. They always had. And no matter how much they'd lost, they had something far more valuable: freedom, authenticity, and the chance to build their own family on their terms. The storm wasn't over. Far from it. But they had survived the worst of it. And now, together, they would face whatever came next. A week passed, then another, and the heaviness of it all started to settle in. The reality was hard to ignore. Alex's family had cut ties with them, and despite everything they had hoped for, nothing was getting better. The calls stopped, the texts turned cold, and it was like they'd been erased. In a way, it was what Sarah had expected, but she'd been holding on to some small hope that things would somehow work out. Maybe they'd come around. Maybe they'd see how wrong they were, how much they still loved Alex and wanted to make things work. But no! It was over. Sarah didn't know what to say to him when the finality hit. It wasn't like he needed any more reminders. He wasn't blind to the situation. He'd felt the loss in his gut, too. But every now and then, she caught him staring at his phone, his expression distant, as if he was waiting for a message that would never come. It was hard for her to watch. She hated seeing him like that, feeling like he was torn between the life he had known and the one he was trying to build with her. One night, after another day of silence from his family, they sat on the couch together, side by side, not saying much. There was no need for words anymore. Sarah reached out and took his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. It wasn't a grand gesture. She wasn't trying to fix anything. She just wanted him to know she was there. "I miss them," Alex finally said, breaking the quiet. His voice was quiet, filled with a mix of grief and resignation. "I don't know if I'll ever stop missing them." Sarah's heart tightened at the pain in his voice. She wished she could take away his sorrow. But she knew that sometimes, you didn't get to take the easy road. Sometimes, you had to walk through the fire. "I know, baby," she said softly. "I know. But we've got each other. And we'll make it through this." He didn't reply right away, and Sarah didn't press him. She knew he wasn't looking for a solution, he was just grieving. Grieving the family he'd lost, the ideals he'd been raised with, and the guilt that came with it all. It wasn't easy, and it wouldn't be anytime soon. But they were in this together, and no matter how hard it got, she wasn't going anywhere. As time went on, they began to find a new rhythm. They didn't need to talk about his family every single day. Instead, they focused on building their own future. They got closer, not just emotionally but also practically. They started making decisions together, big and small: what city they wanted to settle in, how they wanted to structure their life, how they could begin to surround themselves with the kind of people who would love and accept them for who they truly were. It wasn't about replacing his family. It was about finding their own tribe, their own community. They began exploring new hobbies, rediscovering passions they'd neglected before. Sarah threw herself into a side project she had put on hold for months, and Alex, who had been hesitant at first, started getting more involved with a local group of people who shared his interests in things like philosophy and art. Slowly but surely, they started to form new relationships. Friends who saw them as individuals, not as some package deal of expectations and old traditions. It was a different kind of love, uncomplicated, free. And it felt good. But even with these new connections, there were still moments when the absence of Alex's family hit like a ton of bricks. Holidays were hard, at first. It wasn't that Sarah wanted his family to come running back. She didn't. But the empty space at the dinner table was a constant reminder of what they'd lost. It wasn't a void that could be filled with anything else. Not immediately, anyway. One particularly rough Christmas, Alex sat by the window, staring out at the snow. His thoughts seemed to drift far away, and Sarah knew he was thinking about his parents, about the life he had walked away from. She didn't know how to make it better. She didn't know if it could ever get better. But she knew one thing: they had something even his family could never take away. The next day, Alex turned to her, his expression soft. "Maybe we'll never have them back," he said, almost as if he were trying to convince himself. "Maybe I've lost them forever. But we're enough. I've got you. And I can't keep letting their anger dictate my life. I've spent too much time trying to make them proud, and I've lost track of what matters most. I can't do that anymore." Tears pricked at Sarah's eyes, and she smiled softly. "I know. I feel the same way." In that moment, Sarah realized something. It wasn't just about surviving. It wasn't just about holding on and getting through the tough times. It was about accepting the fact that they had the power to create their own happiness, their own future. It was up to them to make the life they wanted. It wasn't going to be easy. The past would always be there, lurking in the background, casting long shadows. But it wasn't who they were anymore. They had made their choice. And now, they were moving forward, together. Stronger than ever before. Not because they had it all figured out, but because they knew that as long as they had each other, they could face anything that came their way. As the days went by, the grief didn't completely go away. But the burden was lighter. And every now and then, Alex would glance at Sarah with a quiet smile, a silent acknowledgement that, no matter what had been lost, there was still so much to gain. Together, they had everything they needed. And in the end, that was enough.